Egyptians, they're also anarchists. We have a problem with authority for a number of historical reasons. So anything that allows you to circumvent friction is part of our DNA. By design, that's what the tech industry is. When you're starting to come into fintech infrastructure, you collide with an oligopolistic industry that has very different incentives.
What happens if they decide, we tried, we don't like it, now we're going to close the doors and eat the market? In that case, all of us should find other jobs. Hello, Internet, and welcome to the 5th episode of the RelCap podcast. My name is Kyane, and I'm a partner at RelCap. Today's guest is Tamer Azer from Shorooq Partners. Shorooq is one of the leading VC firms in the MENA region, currently deploying from their $150 million C-stage fund. They're well known for constantly challenging the status quo by bringing new initiatives to the region, such as a dedicated venture debt fund or a gaming specialist fund. Their track record speaks for itself, being an early investor in Tamara, the freshly minted unicorn out of Saudi. They're also investors in Pure Harvest and Trucker, who both raised over $100 million in their recent Series C, as well as Meme Card and Lean Technologies. Tamer is the most down-to-earth investor in the Egyptian tech scene. He doesn't play ego games, and he is dedicated to his craft. Without further ado, let's get into the conversation. Tamer, thanks for hosting us in Shorooq's office.
No, anytime, man. It's nice to have you.
You tried different firms and moved your way up. You've been able to see how different VCs operate. I'm building parallels with my own path. Every time you go into these different houses, you take things that you really like and the other stuff you say, it's not for me and I'm not that kind of investor. And it's a journey of discovering yourself and who you truly are. Is that also a journey that you went through during the different phases? Did you discover who Tamer was as an investor?
Absolutely. And it takes time. In the beginning, you start getting full exposure to the world of investing. Everything is new. Every transaction is different. Eventually, you start learning more about what kind of transactions you like, what you don't like, what you think is worth investing in, what you think is not. And slowly but surely, you form professionally. You develop your own thesis.
When do you think a switch happened between I'm improvising, I have no idea what the hell I'm doing, I'm just repeating what I'm hearing in the industry, and when at some point something clicked and you started really thinking for yourself?
Yeah, it's tough to pinpoint that exactly, but I think it happened on a transactional basis. The more transactions I did and the more time I spent with founders and the more I started seeing how companies grow and how they scale and how they behave in the market in which they operate is when I started realizing, okay, I actually now have an idea of what type of company I want to back, when I want to back it, what I expect that company to have, the founders I want to invest with. And once that happened, what I get excited about, and I'm not a very excitable person, so when I get excited, I have a lot of conviction in what I want to invest in.
I'm curious, when you're in a firm, then move to another firm, you've already built relationships with founders and you've been supporting them, working hard with them and spending days at their offices. What happens when you transition to a different firm and tell them, you know what, you were my portfolio company, but now someone else is paying me for somebody else and maybe their portfolio is clashing with this portfolio, so I cannot help you anymore. It feels like you're breaking up with the founder for something that is beyond you and beyond them.
Yeah, that's never very pretty because you're very emotionally invested in a company when you've spent years working very closely with them and helping them, and you build a genuine personal relationship with the founder. And it is a breakup, but ultimately we're people. I have a career just like they have a career and they have ambition and I have ambition. And it's a reality that we all have to deal with, whether it's a founder or a VC. So when a founder, for example, will come to me after I've supported them for many years and not give me an allocation on one of the rounds because a much bigger global VC is coming in, that hurts too. Yeah. We're all people and we all get hurt. But at the end of the day, we all have our own ambitions and our own aspirations and the things that we want to do with our lives. And we all have to understand that at the end of the day, we're just people moving along life and having our own priorities.
We've met over the years and you've been growing fast in your career. When you look back at the Tamer from 4 years ago, do you sometimes feel embarrassed? Like, I was so naive. Or why was I even thinking like that? Because that's a sign of growth.
Totally. I was way too trusting in the beginning, way too confident that things will work out, that companies will grow and that we will find money and everything's going to be fine. But the reality is far different from that. It's not always actually about money. I've learned that most companies that collapse, yes, of course, there's a large percentage of them that collapse because they can't find money and that these are the ones you hear about. But actually there's a lot of other companies that collapsed because founders didn't get along or a co-founder bailed or a board wasn't conducting its fiduciary duty appropriately or all sorts of things, right? So there's way more reason than capital for companies collapsing and you don't think about those.
In your learning journey, you've been discovering and investing in new geographies. When you get to a new market, you're like, I don't know them. I don't even know how they compare to my own country where I've been operating for so long. wrong. In your case with A15, it was Egypt only with Saudi. I think it was Egypt only with some Tunisia, Morocco, and now with Shorooq, you're doing MENA, PT. How can you invest in a country that you don't know anything about?
I'd say it's more in the years than the months to really understand the market, how it operates, how people there think. It takes time to build a reputation that allows you space in that market. So you can move in and start investing into a new market all you want, because people will always take money, but it's not about that. It's actually about you building a reputation in that market where you transition from pushing yourself into the market to pulling opportunities. So opportunities start coming to you. One of the things that I've done in a lot of the new markets was there's a session I give called Ask an Investor, and I've given it over 100 times in the past years. It's the exact same session, exact same slides. I've given it in numerous markets over and over again. This doesn't lead to deal opportunities today, but it does lead to reputation building at the grassroots level. The other thing that's really important is to intentionally build a personal brand in that market, what kind of investor you are. And the only way to do that is through a lot of conversations with a lot of startups. Statistically, you invest in actually a very small portion of the companies that you need. But Shorooq, annually, we look at probably 3,000 companies and we invest in 50. But it's the other 2,985 companies, how you treat them, being consistent, being knowledgeable, asking the right questions, being prepared for their call. You're not just sitting on the call and texting your buddies and you're just pretending like you're engaged, opening your camera, asking questions. That's how you build a reputation, by being consistent, even if you don't invest, by being present, attentive, and asking the right questions. You start building a reputation. The third thing you do in a new market is to build relationships with people on the ground. Having a local VC on the ground is extremely important. So you have to go about it in these three ways.
Every time we meet, you leave me super excited about Egypt. That's a superpower that you have. You're so positive and optimistic about this market. Currently, the sentiment's way more negative, especially across founders, but even investors. Some of them are slowing down. Some of them just want to do GCC and they don't want to touch Egypt. I think they're overreacting. They went from hysteria, like optimism, to doom and gloom. Do you still think that on a long time horizon, Egypt is booming startup-wise?
Absolutely. I've seen Egyptian founders who spent probably from 2016 to 2020 on $100,000. And now they're a $150, $200 million company. People here are tech savvy. They have so much friction in their lives that any opportunity that makes their lives easier is an instant adoption. I remember very clearly the moment that shifted for me. I was finishing grad school. Shortly after that, Uber was thinking of launching in Egypt. At the time, I was like, that's insane. Egyptians will never go for that. And I was totally wrong, completely, unequivocally wrong. And that was the moment when I realized that Egyptians want things that makes their life easier. They're also anarchists, and they don't like, we have a problem with authority for a number of different historical reasons. So anything that allows you to circumvent friction is part of our DNA. By nature and by design, that's what the tech industry is. So there's a very strong cultural affinity towards disruption. There's a certain click that I didn't see before and I didn't realize or respect until I saw what Uber and Kareem were able to do in Egypt at a moment where I was like, there's no way on earth this can work.
I heard from a fellow VC yesterday that while most Egyptian founders will spend money and time and energy getting distracted by trying to force a Saudi entry, the ones who stay here and focus on Egypt will eat the market.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. You can build an absolutely mass company without leaving the Egyptian market. The reason everyone is so obsessed now about moving is because of macro risk, foreign currency risk, but you can genuinely build, and we've seen some absolutely massive conglomerates come out of Egypt and go global. Orascom, Suidi, Arab contractors. It wasn't until they reached an absolutely massive scale locally that they were able to leverage that scale and that experience to expand. But the market dynamics in the tech industry and capital is forcing people to build bridges to other markets much faster, which might end up in the long term be a good thing.
Which leads us to the next point, your personal thesis. I don't know if it's Shorooq's thesis or your thesis, but I've known it through you, which is really like investing in non-obvious stuff, in blind spots, off the beaten path. Can you tell more about that and we'll share some examples?
Yeah, look, when VC was created in an industry back in the 70s, it was about pushing the boundaries of innovation and investing in really new ideas and concepts. It was about defense technology, space technology, the telecom industry, semiconductors.
Not the 10th digital bank.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Today, you add to these four AI and biotech/tech bio. And that's where you really push the boundaries of innovation. That's the infrastructure that allows everything else to be possible. If you look at what NASA did to technology, if you look at what the US did to defense technology and where that technology went afterwards. That's what created the massive growth in technology that we see, right? The internet came from there, semiconductors came from there. So if you really want to push the boundaries of innovation, you have to build the infrastructure on which this can work.
At TrilyCap, we have two main axes of interest is fintech and climate. So I'm curious about Shorooq or yours. Let's start with fintech. I think it's easier. What's your thesis for Egypt, for North Africa, or for MENA in general? What has been built successfully? What's yet to be built? And what are all the fluffy things that are being built that shouldn't even exist and you think that they're just going to disappear?
How I think about fintech. In the world of fintech, I think back end, front end, and middleware. The back end is infrastructure. In our portfolio, you're talking about companies like Lean that do open banking. You're talking about companies like Nimcard. These are companies on which other fintech companies can be built. What are the other companies that get built? These are the middleware. Let's think together about the P&L of a company. In order to have revenue, you need payments. The first wave of fintech was about payments, top line. Then you started seeing companies build for the SG&A component. These are expense management guys, the Brex of the world, or in our portfolio, for example, we have Pemo. These are companies that will cover your SG&A, your expenses. The next wave of companies that's coming up now is in the COGS area, accounts payable, accounts receivable, treasury management. That's the middleware. So first you get coverage on infrastructure, then you build the next wave of coverage of middleware. It's these companies that help you manage your P&L and execute on it. And then finally you have front-end fintech. Front-end fintech are guys that do lending, digital banks. So these are consumer-facing or B2B facing that are not inherently within the layer of infrastructure or the middleware layer.
Do you think we finally reached a level of maturity where the backend and the middleware are solid enough where we can finally build the consumer facing?
We're getting there. The biggest problem we have is that we don't have homogeneity across banking regulation or across central banks. So when it comes to financial regulation across the region, we're not a region. Each country has its own sort of regulatory framework and infrastructure that allows these companies. So it's still a patch-up job, but we are getting there.
Totally agree on the infra approach, and that has been our thesis for years now. And we've done all the banking as a service to card issuance, to open banking, to cross-border payments, all of that. But then in Egypt, we've been looking closely for 3-4 years, and we've only pulled the trigger on one company. I think there's a massive lack of infra being built. Everyone is creating a consumer-facing app with a wallet and some cool features. But who's building the fintech APIs, who's connecting, who's doing the networks? I don't know if it's a pure regulation problem where it's so close that nobody can touch it, or do you think it's a generalization, but most Egyptian founders think B2C first and not really infra APIs, pipes?
So the infra API bit, let's talk about that last, right? So we actually have a very healthy consumer-facing side or front end. We do now have at least one company, if not more, in the middleware. What we're lacking is the back end. The back end is a little bit tricky in Egypt because the banking industry has been very well protected and has been a really important pillar of the economy and the public sector for a very long time. So when you're starting to come into fintech infrastructure, you collide with an oligopolistic industry that has very different incentives and very different ideas of how this space should be managed. And that's why we haven't really seen a lot of growth on the infrastructure side. But we have a fully fledged front end and we have at least one company in every part of the middleware.
Then it's about the subtle fight between the incumbents and fintechs, and then central bank is somewhere in between trying to marry both. What would it take for incumbents to open up and say, you know what, we can make much more money if we work with you guys? And then what happens if they decide otherwise, which is, okay, we gave this startup thingy 8 years, we tried, we don't like it, now we're going to close the doors and just eat the market. And in that case, all of us should find other jobs.
I think the moment we start thinking less about macro problems and macro pressures kind of decline, we can start looking towards the future. But so long as you're anchored and hurtling from one crisis to the next from a macroeconomic perspective, it's really hard to focus on the future.
You have dry powder to play with. When you look at your fintech portfolio, you said we have the card issuance and processing covered. We have the open banking APIs covered. How do you find the interest and appetite to continue doing new stuff in fintech if your portfolio is already covering so many grounds?
Now we're deploying in the area, the AP, AR, and treasury management. That for us is the next wave. We're going to start seeing a lot of these companies, unlike in more mature markets where you see these guys all converging into digital banks. We believe in this market because of interest rates and because of spreads, many of these companies will converge into lending. And the next wave of lending has to be on lend. You have to be able to give somebody else's money.
That's where we lose foreign VCs. When the conversation becomes about lending, it's a taboo word. It's probably because of how the US or the West has been building venture capital and it's software and tech and good margins, and lending is less sexy and it's just a
low interest
right?
rates. Yeah.
But we don't have a choice. There's a credit grab and someone needs to bridge it. It cannot happen because they cannot serve it, and they cannot serve it because they don't have the KYC, they don't have the data. The tech is here to build that kind of bridge, and then a flood of credit line needs to come to bridge it. But what do we do if this is the most pressing need that our SMEs have, for example, which is the bedrock of the economy? But then the VC wisdom is that, oh, no, lending and in this country and inflationary and devaluation, yeah, that's not interesting. That's not VC backable. So how do we marry these both ideas?
That's a European and American mindset. That's not a problem. Our markets have been for a very long time not really super friendly with debt. The banks don't like debt. People don't like debt. It's a cultural issue. And the reality is that many banks across the region, if not the vast majority of them, have enormous cash reserves that they're not deploying. So they keep giving people really high interest and then loaning the big corporations
and governments.
A lot of the banks have dry powder and they don't know what to do with it. They don't have the infrastructure to be able to make better lending decisions. They don't like it. They don't know it. They don't want to do it. So somebody has to deploy this capital, because otherwise our banks are going to keep giving out money to governments and giving out money to individuals. Maybe at best you have a mortgage-based industry. Then you're not really growing the economy. The lending enterprises and SMEs is one of the best ways to scale an economy. So we need someone to deploy the cash that is stuck on bank balance sheets across the whole region.
Someone might listen to what you said and say, you know what? Someone should build a company that's a lending as a service with heavy data, and then they plug into these banks and then give loans to SMEs because they have better tech and better data points. But it's not as simple, and one player cannot solve this.
No, because first you need things like KYC companies. Then you need credit rating that's integrated with OCR and KYC just to be able to execute transactions. Then you need ACH integrations with the bank so you can actually extract the capital and deploy it somewhere else.
And it has to work.
Right? And then you need monitoring companies and accounting companies. So the ecosystem to lend or on lend is very underdeveloped. If you want to borrow from a bank, even if you are like an old company with healthy profits, you still have to go through an extremely manual process that actually decisioning is very subjective. And if you know the right banker, you'll get the loan. That's not an efficient market. If you want economic growth across the region, we have to improve the efficiency of the lending market. And we have to deploy not equity, but the cash that's sitting idle on the balance sheets of the banks.
Yeah. Can someone argue that because one of the most pressing needs to be solved in the global south is this whole lending and credit gap, then by definition, it's not really a VC market, meaning maybe VC is not the best asset class to solve this.
But VCs will help create the companies that increase efficiency.
I want to touch on venture debt because you're one of the few firms who has a dedicated venture debt fund. Whenever I travel and meet with founders back to back, they all mention we got some equity, but now we need debt, we need a credit line. It's all about improving the cash flows for the suppliers, for the clients. It is at heart a cash flow issue. They cannot raise USD debt. It needs to be local debt. And then we have these big institutions or NGOs that want to help unlock the bottlenecks of ecosystems. They're like, what are your needs? We want to help. We have some budget. But whenever you ask for venture debt, institutions are hesitant about it. But you guys weren't afraid and you went for it.
Why venture debt is a fantastic opportunity today is what we were just talking about on the lack of lending. There's information asymmetry. When you first take Finance 101, one of the first things that you learn is that when you add debt to your balance sheet, your cost of capital declines and your enterprise value increases. It is extremely expensive to finance working capital from equity. So debt is a desperate need. In the absence of the ability of companies to raise from banks, there's a perfect sweet spot between Series A and Series B or C when you can raise from banks and you can't raise from anybody. Debt.
Yeah.
That middle is where venture debt should be. And you are helping companies grow in a less expensive way. It is in your best interest to help your companies find venture debt.
If the need for venture debt is so clear, why doesn't everyone start doing venture debt?
I don't know what to tell you.
Okay.
I don't know what to tell you because the opportunity is absolutely immense and it's right there. We were the first, and I know that now we're seeing a lot more firms raise venture debt funds or new venture debt fund managers are emerging.
Let's switch gears a bit and talk about climate. There's exceptional founders moving to climate, regulatory tailwinds, a global awareness. My partner Hayden would argue that everything is becoming climate. Even if you're not a climate company, there's going to be a climate component to your company in the next decade. Does Shorooq have a thesis around climate?
The frontier that we've pushed into now has been deep tech, which I am starting to see some companies in climate come through that pipe.
Yeah.
We are still very much seeing climate at the macro level, at least in the region. You're looking at solar, wind, clean coal, hydrogen. Many of these companies, once they exist, will create a deeper need for the different companies to service them. When you think what need to exist to improve the efficiency of these companies, then you can start building a thesis on climate tech. If you're looking at solar, you're going to be looking at predictive maintenance. You're going to be looking at AI imaging to look and see when something needs to be changed or fixed. You're looking at distribution. You're looking at bill payments in that space, how to manage your customers. So the ecosystem is still evolving. What I wouldn't do is take a top-down approach in climate and look at what is working in Europe in terms of impact measurement and measuring your carbon footprint. It's way too early for our market. What you want to focus on is efficiency. What kind of tech companies can actually help the big climate infrastructure players do their job better?
And that's localization play, basically.
It
right?
is, or at least to some extent. You're going to need to see how markets evolve. So that wave is coming. It's growing, but it's less sequential than, say, fintech.
We talked about how you're working on filling your gaps. What do you think are the current gaps, and what's your aspiration for a better Tamer as an investor in the next 5 years?
Look, man, so the average lifespan of a VC is like 7 years. So I don't know how many more 5 years I've got in me, right? No, I'm kidding. But yeah, it is 7 years. Look, I think at this stage, I want to really build on my ability to help founders think strategically about IPOing. Most of the region, at least the 3 big markets, Saudi, UAE, and Egypt, they all have a mid-market exchange. They all have the main exchange. Every market has a mid-cap and a large cap trading index. We can own the mid-cap exchange. So if we can become masters of our own sort of destiny, I know this sounds really cheesy and very hyperbolic, but we can. And we can give young people an opportunity to invest in the companies that they use every day. Instead of investing in apartment buildings and fixed income assets in the banks that pay you barely above inflation, if not lower. It is okay for us to have our own model. If a company reaches $200 million in any market, we're going to list it on a mid-market cap and open it to its employees, open it to friends, open it to their customers. Instead of opening the institutional, so when you do an IPO, usually it's first open to institutions, then it's open to retail.
Yeah.
Open it to the customers first. We can innovate in how we scale companies. We don't have to follow the same model. There are tremendous opportunities for us to do our own thing, right? I don't have to keep waiting for the 5 big growth funds that are around the world who don't like our markets anyway, and they don't see us. Here's the biggest problem, right? All the growth capital doesn't see the Middle East as an opportunity, an investment opportunity with returns. They see it as a place to raise fund, right? And every time we think we're going to change it, something happens and it changes back.
Yeah, but I think it's because this country is also highly political. They're like, I want to do pure business. I want to sit on a table and talk numbers. And if these people are like, Habibi, come and let's talk and whatever, I don't want to get into the politics of it.
That's fair, right?
If they don't want to do it, we have to do it locally, but we need the local champions to.
Exactly. I don't have to change their minds.
Yeah.
It's much easier for me to do my own thing than keep trying to bark up that tree just to try and change the mind of 1 or 2 funds about the opportunity in the market. I know my own opportunity and I can scale it and I can grow it and I can make money off of it.
As usual, you leave me super pumped and give me that excitement, that energy every time I meet you. Tamer, you're awesome. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, man. Thank you for having me.